Episode 3, welcome to our podcast. This is the third of a 4-part series. In the last episode, we learned why human wrongs are being masqueraded as human rights. In this episode, we will learn more about how the United Nations is attempting to replace our universal human rights, substituting sexual rights that are intended to trump all other rights. As you listen to this episode, I invite you to keep in mind a few of the universal human rights that have long existed in international law.
The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. The social significance of maternity, motherhood, and the role of parents in the family and in the upbringing of children should be acknowledged. Maternity, motherhood, parenting, and the role of women in procreation must not be a basis for discrimination. The best interests of the child shall be the guiding principles of those responsible for his or her education and guidance. That responsibility lies in the first place with the parents. The primary responsibility for the protection, upbringing, and development of children rests with the family. The state parties to the present covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents, to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions.
To understand how these human rights are being trampled, let's start with Sharon Slater, the president of Family Watch International.
You have what's called UN Human Rights that's based in Geneva, Switzerland. And UN Human Rights has all these mechanisms that are supposed to promote human rights. For example, you have special rapporteurs. They're supposed to be the top experts in the world that are going to advocate and let nations know where they're going wrong on human rights on specific issues. Then you have what are called the UN treaty bodies. These are the committees that are set up by treaties of people that are assigned, and the countries all agree who gets to be on those committees. And they're supposed to monitor compliance with countries' compliance with various different human rights treaties. There's 9 core human rights treaties. You have the UN top expert on the right to life and the UN committee. They just decided that the right to life includes abortion for the woman, which is the exact opposite of what the right to life is. You have in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child where it says children have a right for protection before as well as after birth. And then you have the committee that's monitoring compliance, with these issues or other human rights issues contradicting that right completely for the child.
Such contradictions and pronouncements by the treaty bodies and by special rapporteurs are not legally binding like the treaties themselves, but they can carry a sort of moral authority and do bring substantial pressure on nation states to comply. We have with us again Bill Saunders, a Harvard Law School graduate and professor of human rights. Bill, how do you view what is happening today?
Sometimes we think the UN doesn't matter. You think, oh, this is a bunch of stupid, silly stuff. It's not. It's dangerous. When you combine activist courts with these kind of crazy assemblies that issue crazy statements, our own liberty can be, our own freedom, our own lives and families can be at risk.
But if we just take, for example, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, this committee that's monitoring compliance actually says that now this includes that children have sexual freedom, that they should be able to access sexual and reproductive health services, which is really a euphemism for abortion, without parental knowledge and consent, that they have a right to comprehensive sexuality education. In other words, instead of working on children's protection rights that we all agree on, they're trying to give children adult sexual rights, and this is harmful to children. So children are losing their protections, especially in the area of parental rights. If we talk about parental rights, then you have the UN Declaration of Human Rights that everybody reveres as one of the top documents that expounds on all the human rights. And in that document, it says that parents have the prior right to guide the education of their children. Yet, all these UN human rights systems, the UN experts, the UN committees, the UN working groups, and the UN agencies are constantly undermining that right and trying to grant children autonomous rights. Even UNICEF is saying that children should be able to consent without parental knowledge or consent to sexual and reproductive health services and these other things.
Stefano Giannani is Vice President of Legal Studies at CFAM. Stefano, what would you like to give us insights on today?
For example, the term sexual and reproductive health has been in UN resolutions for over 2 decades now. And it's been implemented by the UN system as including a right to abortion, a right to LGBT issues, a right to even in vitro fertilization in some UN documents. And unless UN member states actively object to this in interpretation of UN resolutions, in actual fact what's happening is over time they are creating a customary international right to these issues through policies involving sexual and reproductive health in UN resolutions.
Susan Roylance, a founder of United Families International, is with us again. Susan, can you tell us what happens when people object to UN agendas?
A woman from Honduras, who was a delegate from her country, had noticed that with the Secretariat, they had noticed that the translation of the word gender into Spanish was that it meant male and female. And the Secretariat says, oh, no, that's not what it means. And she said, this was Marta Costco, she said, well, what does that mean? And she hemmed and hawed around, and so she moved to bracket that word throughout the document until they came up with a definition. Now at the UN, when they're trying to do a document by consensus, if something is bracketed, it just stays bracketed until such time as they come up with some kind of a consensus as to what it means or doesn't mean. If they can't come up with that, they eliminate it. Well, you couldn't eliminate the word gender, so that was very serious. And Honduras at that time was the poorest country in this hemisphere, may still be. I don't know who is considered the poorest right now. But the USAID representative from the US to that particular conference told her that if she didn't take those brackets off, all humanitarian aid to the country of Honduras would be stopped. She called her president of her country and asked him what to do, and he said, you hang in there, don't you dare give up. Well, the pressure that was put on her was intense, and she got very sick, and she actually didn't even end up in Beijing for the main conference because she just couldn't deal with all the pressure that was put on her.
Someone proposes to put abstinence when you're, education, when we're talking about children, the whole room will erupt and debates, and the EU will do all these deceptive tactics and pressure their countries. They'll even start, the US government, the EU, they'll call capitals, they'll lie about what their UN diplomat is doing and saying he's standing up for things that he shouldn't be, and everybody's agreed on this, and your guy's doing this, and you need to recall them. And a number of good diplomats have been recalled just because of lies. But then you have governments who understand the games that the EU and the UN agencies sometimes do this as well. The former ambassador from St. Lucia to the United Nations, she had UNAID send a letter to all the Caribbean countries when she was standing up for the protection of children in an HIV document, and she eventually got fired. This is the games that they play and the pressures that they put on countries.
Such extortion tactics are happening internationally. Even sovereign countries who have their own pro-family constitutions and domestic laws are under attack. Also with us today is the Honorable Samuel George and Ambassador Emmanuel Mwamba. And Honorable Sonway, gentlemen, what happens when you try to enact pro-family laws within your own sovereign countries today?
You can really see a lot of push, especially from the European Union as well. The European Union, the British, and IPPF, Planned Parenthood Foundation, that's doing a lot of work to try and push sexual and reproductive health and rights in Ghana. They were at the center of the CSE attempt to introduce CSE into our curriculum. You also have the UN agencies. In fact, during the public hearings, the UN agency, the country director of the United Nations, came with a heavy team, a team of heavy hitters to attack the bill and to debate us in the public hearings. You actually had the UN send in a request for a virtual link because they couldn't fly in quickly to bring in the UN rapporteurs. And so you had the UN special rapporteurs take part in our public hearings, and they officially wrote to the president of Ghana. The 12 rapporteurs signed a public document, almost 30-page long, to the president of Ghana, spelling out dire consequences to Ghana and our economy and the country if the president did not put his foot down to shut the bill. And so you've seen the UN try to use his might, using his agencies and the special rapporteurs to fight the bill. You've seen civil society, academia. We had funding from a US NGO to 13 top university lecturers and deans across universities in Ghana put together an academic paper against the bill.
So we have two fundamental programs that are being pushed across Africa. These are being pushed under two key ministries. One of them is Ministry of Health and the other one Ministry of Education. So under Ministry of Health, you have sexual and reproductive health and rights, and under Ministry of Education, you have comprehensive sexuality education. The concerns around these two major policies, first of all, they are not African in nature. They were not inspired in Africa. They were not written by Africans. They are an imposition from what we'd call the West, in Nordic countries and UK, Canada, and America, imposing these two programs to become mainstream, to discuss issues related to health, reproductive health, and sexual education. Because what has happened is when we are discussing, for example, climate change, they'll sneak in a program of sexual, reproductive health and rights. They'll sneak in comprehensive sexuality education. If we are discussing poverty, they will ensure that those two programs are embedded in what we are talking about. So I call for alertness.
Traditionally, we believe that our children should have the benefit of them being children. What they can know should be something that is properly moderated, that is appropriate for their age. The element to do with the comprehensive sexuality education, which is being advanced already in some countries, children as young as at the age of 10, they are now being taught in terms of how they can gratify themselves, how abstinence is not the only option for them, to enjoy sexual encounters, and how they should be responsive to their bodies and what they can be doing, and the freedom they have to change their sexual identity. So these are some of what are looked at as taboos, which are foreign to our culture, foreign to our tradition, foreign to our Christian and family values. At the same time, the advance on the abortions, they're causing a lot of anxieties on the African values.
Peter Sprigg is with us again today. Some are calling this a form of cultural imperialism. Peter, what is your opinion on that?
Those countries where this is already pretty much a dominant ideology are seeking to impose it upon other countries in the world, other parts of the world, in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and so forth, where their cultural and religious traditions are very resistant to this. And so they are using the mechanisms that we now have of international relations, including the United Nations and other international organizations, the whole system of aid and development, donor countries and large foundations which give charitable donations to developing countries, and large non-governmental organizations, of which the most influential is Planned Parenthood, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, or IPPF. These are kind of this iron triangle of the UN, the NGOs, and the donors, donor countries and foundations that are working to impose this on countries that where this is not part of their culture or tradition. I do believe we are seeing a form of cultural imperialism where the Western countries are not conquering these lands with guns and weapons anymore, but they are still conquering these lands with the new weapons of modern information technology, and still with a hostile and alien ideology. And they make these countries feel like if they want to be progressive, if they want to be developed countries, they need to imitate what places like Europe and the United States are doing. And there is, although there may not be the kind of violence that was used in the imperialism of past centuries, there is coercion. There is definitely coercion in which foreign aid may be withheld from countries if they do not agree to go along with this radical sexual agenda, and there are sanctions whereby there are incentives given to go along with it, and there are punishments that are imposed upon countries that do not go along with it. So I think to use the term cultural imperialism is entirely appropriate for what we see happening.
Ironically, in order to foster world peace, the UN originally created institutions to protect and preserve the cultures and religious rights of people and of their sovereign countries. Where is that UN now?
It's so ironic, because if you look at UNESCO, UNESCO is the United Nations Education Social Cultural Organization. Social Cultural Organization. UNESCO is charged with protecting the cultures of the world. UNESCO is one of the most hostile towards culture when it comes to these issues. They may preserve all these buildings and do these things that are non-controversial, but when it comes to social issues, they are the ones that established in 2009 the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. And that was the beginning of the UN launch to sexualize children across the world.
It's a big difference between comprehensive sexuality education and sex education. Even sex education can be a problem, but comprehensive sexuality, even sexuality education, is difficult because you're not talking about male and female sex. You're talking about all different kinds of sex. In some of these classes that are sexuality education, not sex education, they teach them how to demonstrate what a man and a man would do to show affection. What would a woman and a woman do to show affection? I mean, it's supposedly all in the name of education, but by the time you start at the beginning of that 4 years and you get all the way through the program into the last, you've acclimated them to the whole concept that this is all okay. This is just the way some people live, and so we need to understand these people. And the interesting thing is, by the time you get to the end, they're teaching them to be advocates, to be out marching on the streets. And
they even go to, well, the sexual knowledge you need to have to be able to realize sexual rights is you need to know all the sexual patterns. And it lists voyeurism, exhibitionism, pederasty, bestiality, necrophilia, urophilia, and it goes on. And they ask the children to, study this list and choose the two they're going to share with the classroom. I mean, what possible good could possibly come from putting any of these ideas in a child's head. This is sexual abuse, and yet you have all these UN agencies funded by the European Commission pushing this on children, especially in developing countries.
And as everybody listening to this probably realizes, the pro-life, pro-family fight has to be international, because the tool used by anti-life, anti-family forces is to say there's a human right under international law to these various bad things. So we have to realize that we need to have solidarity with other countries, help them, because otherwise it'll come back to us, to our court.
Some of the biggest goals by those who have infiltrated the UN to push this agenda is they want to establish an international right to abortion, an international right for sexuality education for children to shape their sexual and gender views and all, regarding all these things from the earliest ages. They want to obliterate religious freedom because it is religious figures and religions and religious values that people hold that stops their agenda, that blocks it, and that's why they call that a barrier. And they want to get especially rid of parental rights, because if parents have those rights to decide the education of their children, they can't get to them with this comprehensive sexuality education agenda. And the comprehensive sexuality education agenda is going to separate the child from their religious views, from their parents' views. But not only that, after they indoctrinate them in this radicalized human rights, which we really call human wrongs agenda, they actually send children out, give them homework to start advocating for all these radical rights.
So I hope everybody listening would want to go to the UN either with an NGO, a non-governmental organization, or get appointed to an official US delegation or whatever, because we have to, the old saying is, if you shine the light on something, whatever's going on in the dark doesn't happen. The rats scurry away or the bad behavior stops. We have to shine a light on the UN because it's very dangerous. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of people who believe in population control, and it has to be resisted.
In this episode, we have seen how some of these destructive human wrongs are being advanced worldwide. Despite universal human rights laws that should protect the innocence of children, parental rights, and the cultures of these needy nations around the world, and our religious liberties, these issues need to be shared, heard, and understood. So thank you for joining with us today. The next episode is number 4. In it, we will learn more about this new cultural imperialism that is being advanced by international organizations. We hope that you will take the courage to stand in this fight for the family.